Welcome, everyone. My name is Patricia Kranz. I'm the Executive Director of the Overseas Press Club. And we're delighted tonight to have another event in our series of award winners having a conversation with the head judges of that award. And tonight, we're talking to the winners of the Lowell Thomas Award. And the winning team is from NPR's Rough Translation podcast. And participating in it is Greg Warner, Karen Duffin and Sebastian Meyer. Ann Cooper, Professor Emerita of the Columbia Journalism School, was the head judge, and she will interview them. And the winning piece of work was called The Search, a two-part podcast. And it was a very moving story about a disappearance of a Kurdish photojournalist. And we're lucky tonight we can hear the backstory of how they got the story. So the panelists will talk for approximately half an hour, and then we can take questions. At any time, you can submit your question by raising your hand in the Zoom box or using the Q&A. And when the time comes, we can take them in order and unmute you, and you can ask it yourself. If you prefer to just have somebody read it, put it in the chat box, and then Anne or one of us will read it. So now I'm delighted to turn it over to Anne. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Patricia, and thanks very much for Overseas Press Club for organizing these discussions, which really give us a chance to hear much more from the journalists who get these annual awards. So I don't know if that's a silver lining of pandemic, but there it is. Take it or leave it. I want to recognize the four other judges who worked on this award. Ann Garrels, one of my longtime colleagues at NPR.
Now it's just my image, but you, all three of you walked back.
Ann Garrels of NPR, longtime foreign correspondent. Suzanne Marmion, who's the news director at KPBS, which is both public radio and public TV in San Diego. Shandukani Maladze is executive producer of podcasts for the Children's Radio Foundation in Johannesburg, South Africa, and Chris Livesay, who is CBS News Rome correspondent. So there were five of us who listened to just amazing broadcasts and came up with The Search as really the one that just grabbed us and told us this incredible story that has some kind of universal themes in it, but also is a very specific story about a single person. This appeared on Rough Translation, which is a podcast that says it takes you to far off places that hit close to home. In this case, the far off place is Iraq, specifically the Kurdish territories of Iraq. And the main character is a young man, Kamaran Najm. He becomes a war photographer when conflict comes to Iraq. And, you know, among the kind of big themes that are explored in this, in the two parts are war, obviously, journalism, you know, how journalism covers war, and also family discord. And that starts pretty quickly once Kamaran becomes a photographer, because his parents kind of had some other thoughts about what he might do as a career, but he's very committed. He meets a lot of foreign correspondents, including Sebastian Meyer. He opens a photo agency, Iraq's first photo agency, and his idea is to train other photographers, not necessarily as war photographers, but he wants a photo agency that tells more than war stories about Iraq. My country is about more than Iraq. Let's show that to the world. Sebastian became a partner in the photo agency. And then the kind of pivotal event in this story actually puts Kamaran back out in the field as a war photographer. ISIS has come to Iraq, and a Kurdish military official calls him and says, we are about to launch an attack against ISIS. You are welcome to come along if you want to cover it. So Kamaran goes, he takes his pictures. He is shot during this battle. He's right there on the front line. Lots of confusion. You do hear some audio of that, amazing audio in the piece. And then, you know, things get really hairy. The shooting continues. The Kurdish military retreats, and Kamaran's body is left there. They go back, they report that the photographer was with them and he was killed. And that is reported on Kurdish media. So the family, all of Kamaran's friends hear that, you know, he has died while being out there covering this story. The next day, Sebastian and one of Kamaran's brothers go in search of the body. And they're, you know, they are out looking around trying to figure out, you know, where it might be. And suddenly a phone call comes through to one of the people with them. And Sebastian, that phone call is such a pivotal moment, also an incredible piece of audio. So tell us about that. This is a photo from that moment.
Yeah, so to, you know, to set the scene before the phone call, we had all been told that Kamaran had been killed. The Kurdish media was reporting it. The Peshmerga, the Kurdish army, their official report was that he was dead. So the day after, about 5, 6 o'clock in the morning, myself, 2 of Kamaran's brothers and a couple friends drove to Kirkuk to coordinate with the local police to figure out how we could get into the area where the battle had been the previous day, how we could access no man's land and retrieve Kamaran's body, which had been left behind. And while we were standing there, this is exactly where we were standing in this photograph. Kamaran called from captivity. Birwa, his best friend from childhood, got the phone call because it was one of the few phone numbers Kamaran had memorized. And he said, "It's me, Kamaran." And it was this sort of unbelievable. I struggle to find the words that can really convey how incredible it was, because we were all told and we all believed, and all the eyewitnesses said that Kamaran had been shot and he died. And it was, you know, this odd Lazarus moment where he came back to life. I had my iPhone on me, so I'll probably talk about this later on, but I was in this very odd role. I lived and worked in Iraq, in the Kurdish region, but covered the region as a journalist. But as soon as this happened, I stopped being a journalist. I was Kamaran's friend, and I was there not as a journalist. I was there to try to rescue him, or at least to retrieve his body until we got the phone call. But there's nothing I could do in that moment. So that's why I reached in my pocket and pulled out my iPhone and snapped this picture and snapped a little bit of video as well. Because it was just an instinct. I didn't know what else to do. And in fact, I had my notebook there to record, again, not for any journalistic purposes, but I knew that tensions were going to be running very high, and my presence there was best served as someone to just record what was going on. So that's how we ended up with this photograph. And in terms of what happened next is, again, as I said, we'd gone there to retrieve his body. Kamaran was dead, and now we had been instantaneously thrown into a different situation where now Kamaran was a hostage, and he was an ISIS hostage. And ISIS had been around long enough, especially in Syria, that we knew what happened to ISIS hostages. So it was both an incredibly uplifting moment that suddenly my best friend was alive, but then immediately it sunk in that it was a terrifying situation, because now he was an ISIS hostage.
am I muted here? Okay, I think it's Gregory Warner who says in the within the story that if Kamaran had been an American journalist, you know, the U.S. government would have stepped in. There would have been, you know, advice, investigation, diplomatic efforts, whatever, on behalf of this journalist. But he wasn't. And in fact, most of the journalists who are kidnapped are local journalists like Kamaran. And so, you know, it ends up being really up to you, Sebastian, and the other friends and the family to conduct this search. And one of the things that you did, this is, I think this photo is inside the photo agency, which became a command center. And you see the whiteboard on there. There's, when I looked at some of these photos, it made me think about, you know, a detective story where they have the whiteboard and, you know, the lines drawn and the little bits of paper and the photos and everything stuck up. This became a huge search. You had a big spreadsheet and someone had advised you put everything in there, every tip that you get. And there were all kinds of tips. Some people contradicted each other. Some wanted money for, you know, we've got information, but pay us some money. And, you know, every lead is being followed up. And it is just, you know, an all-consuming task. As you say, you know, that then became what you were doing while you were there. Somewhere along the way, there's a rift between the friends and the family who, you know, had started out very united in this search. But that develops, and so now things are going kind of on two different tracks. And then Sebastian, you get called back to New York, where you meet Karen Duffin. And Karen, I'd like to ask you to talk about how you came together, how you first heard about this story, and how you decided to move forward with it as a podcast.
Yeah, I met Sebastian on a listserv, for a radio listserv. He is a photographer, but hadn't done audio work before, and he just reached out about actually a different story that he wanted to work on, and it sounded interesting, and I offered to help. And it was probably about a year and a half, right, Sebastian, into since the kidnapping, and we became friends. And I watched as a friend for a bit, and then just said, we should start recording, you know, as you're going through this process. And he had already been recording some. And so about a year and a half after the kidnapping, we started doing interviews. And at the time when I first met Sebastian, he was pretty confident that Kamaran was still alive. And so it was a process of, you know, over the next about 2.5 years of watching, you know, him follow different leads and the emotional process of that and the split in the family. And it just became clear that it was this really human, but this like human scale story, but that spoke to so many different themes. And it just, yeah, it was no question that it would be a beautiful story and honestly a tribute to Kamaran and the work that he had done.
At what point, Gregory Warner, does rough translation come into this? And I wondered, as I was thinking about this, you know, rough translation says it tells stories of far off places that hit close to home. I'm sure that close to home means more than just one of the characters. Sebastian is from New York. How did this fit into rough translation?
No, I appreciate the question. I mean, close to home, you know, we've all been, I think, foreign overseas correspondents here, and you know, that's the typical idea of being a correspondent. You find the American character, the American link, right? And so in some sense, rough translation exists to get away from that. So the close to home aspect for me, well, first of all, as a radio person, the tape that Sebastian and Karen were bringing is just, we couldn't get that anywhere. I mean, the intimacy of the tape, as you referred to in your introduction, it just brings you into places that you can't imagine being. And so it gets into your heart. But also I think the close to home aspect was to think about how we could make this story of this Iraqi journalist feel like it was your friend. I mean, he was your friend because he's a friend of Sebastian. He's the brother of Ahmed. And, we thought a lot about if this were a profile of a Western journalist who went missing, you would learn a lot about their life and not just about their disappearance. And so in some ways, the hardest, the part of the piece that took the longest, most thinking was the first, I guess, around 16 minutes or so when we're building the story of who he was, and trying to make people walk through the shoes of this guy. I mean, Kamaran, his aesthetic as a war correspondent was to not just cover war, and so we wanted to do tribute to that. But when you're talking about him and making him feel real, there's all kinds of translations that you're having to do sort of along the way. Even when we introduce Ahmed, his brother, even sort of introducing the fact that Ahmed doesn't like to be celebrating his birthday, and the birthday party thing is a big part of the first 16 minutes. And having to do that kind of translation work that we wouldn't have had to do for an Iraqi audience. So I think just kind of the close to home for me in rough translation in general is to try to walk in the shoes of somebody else and to feel like this is not a foreign story. This is a story that's happening right here.